A fire took more than a library. It erased whole chapters of human knowledge. It set our progress back by centuries. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is a haunting mystery. It's not just the scale of the loss, it's the specific wisdom that turned to ash. You can understand what vanished in that smoke. You can see how its absence has shaped the world we live in now. We can sift through the ashes. There were lost engineering manuals. They could have sparked an industrial revolution 2,000 years ago. There were original philosophies. They might have changed how we see the universe. The silence of those scrolls is permanent. It tells us something about our own fragile grasp on knowledge. The story isn't really about a building. It's about an idea that feels almost impossible. This was in the 3rd century before the Common Era. In Alexandria, a new Egyptian city, the rulers there, the Ptolemaic dynasty, they gave a command. They wanted to gather every single book in the known world. Not just a collection, a complete archive, an archive of all human thought. To do it, they had a method that was brilliant and ruthless. Royal agents would wait at the docks. At this huge Mediterranean port, when a ship came in, the agents would board it. They would search for scrolls, and they would take them, not to steal them, not for good. They would take them to copy them. Scribes would make a duplicate, a copy. That copy would go back to the ship's owner. The original scroll would go into the vaults, into the great library. So you had to imagine it, a merchant from Athens, a scholar from Persia, all arriving with their texts, and the king's men would just claim them temporarily. This was knowledge acquisition, a state-sponsored project. The goal was absolute comprehensiveness, but this library, it was part of something bigger. The Mauseon, the Temple of the Muses, and it was far more than a warehouse. It was a living university. The greatest minds of the age, they were given salaries, rooms, all the resources they needed. Their job was just to think, to debate, to experiment, and to write. They dined together in a grand hall. They walked through the colonnades arguing about the stars or the meaning of justice, and that created a loop, a feedback loop of genius. A new text would arrive, say from India. It would spark a year of discussion. Commentary that would be written down and added to the shelves. It was an intellectual ecosystem, a self-sustaining engine for discovery. That context is everything. The loss we talk about, it's not a quiet archive. It's the loss of a vibrant, humming brain, a brain at the center of the ancient world. And all that brilliance, all that accumulated wisdom, it was held in the most delicate vessels. The whole thing depended on a biological clock. Those scrolls, the physical objects, they came from the papyrus plant. You cut the stalks, soak them, press them, dry them into sheets. Then you glue those sheets into long rolls. It was a remarkable technology for its time, but it was organic. Think of a dried leaf. A leaf is strong, but over time it gets brittle. It crumbles. Papyrus was like that. It was vulnerable to everything. A little too much humidity and mold would bloom right across the text. A little too dry and the fibers would crack. They'd flake away. Insects thought it was delicious. A single spilled cup of water could blur an entire philosophical argument. Just turn it into an ink-stained ghost. Even on the library's shelves, in a perfect environment, a scroll had a lifespan. Maybe a few hundred years if no one ever touched it. But knowledge that's never touched is already lost. So the library was in a constant, silent battle, a battle against decay itself. There was an army of scribes working in shifts. They weren't just adding new works. They were rescuing the old ones. They'd unroll a treasured text and find the edges had turned to dust. Their job was to copy it, word for painstaking word, onto a fresh scroll. They had to do it before the original disintegrated in their hands. Every generation had to recommit to the memory of the last. The survival of a book wasn't guaranteed. It was a choice. It needed labor, funding, continuous attention. And that's the crucial point. The loss of knowledge wasn't a single event waiting to happen. It was an ongoing condition. Entropy was the library's true enemy. Fire or conflict or simple neglect, those were just the final, dramatic moments. They came after a long process of erosion, and when a disaster did strike, the effect was total, because a scroll consumed by flames is just gone. There was no digital backup. No microfilm, no second edition in a warehouse. If the scribes hadn't gotten to it yet, if it was the only copy, that was it. The ideas inside it ceased to exist in the world. The medium dictated everything. It meant the most obscure texts, the ones only a few scholars studied, were the most vulnerable. They were less likely to be copied widely. They just sat there waiting their turn as time slowly ate away at them. So when we ask what was lost, we're asking about the works on the losing side of that relentless race. The ones the scribes, for whatever reason, didn't reach in time. That fragility, it sets the stage for the first category of loss, maybe the most profound. The voices that spoke at the very dawn of reasoned thought. Thales thought everything was water. Anaximander talked about the boundless. Heraclitus saw a world of fire, constant change. Democritus imagined atoms, tiny and indivisible, moving through empty space. We call them the Pre-Socratics, the ones before Socrates turned to ethics. That word, before, it frames them as just a prelude. We only know their ideas from quotes, from paraphrases in later writers like Aristotle. And Aristotle was usually trying to argue against them. It's like hearing a conversation from another room, but you only catch the voice of the person who walks in afterward. They tell you what was just said and why it was wrong. The Library of Alexandria had their original words, not fragments, full scrolls. You could have read Heraclitus's own cryptic lines about change without Plato's interpretation laid over them. You could have followed Democritus's full case for atoms, all his reasoning intact. These weren't primitive guesses, they were whole systems, attempts to explain the cosmos with observation and logic, not myth. Thales predicted a solar eclipse. Anaximander drew one of the first maps of the world. They were working scientists, philosophers. What vanished in those complete works were the nuances. The dead ends, the brilliant mistakes. When Aristotle summarizes a theory, he's making a point for his own philosophy. He might simplify a complex idea to make it easier to criticize. He might leave out an argument that didn't fit his story. We lose the personality of the thought, the rhetorical style, the texture of that intellectual world. And more than that, we lose alternative pathways. Maybe one of them had a concept of evolution or a theory of gravity, something too radical for Aristotle to even engage with. So it was never quoted, never passed down. That idea would have died on a shelf in Alexandria, a road not taken for human knowledge. That loss cuts us off from our own foundations. It's like a family tree where you know your earliest ancestors' names, but all their diaries and letters were burned. You know they existed, but you can't know them. Their voices are mediated, filtered, second-hand. The burning of those original texts didn't just destroy old books, it collapsed the first floor of a building. Every floor above it hangs in mid-air, supported only by the descriptions written by the later architects. We built our whole tradition of Western science and philosophy on that shaky, second-hand foundation. That absence creates a haunting silence, and it makes the next kind of loss, the stories of nations and peoples, feel even deeper. Manetho was an Egyptian priest. He lived in the 3rd century before the Common Era. He wrote a history of Egypt in Greek for the new rulers there, the Ptolemies. He had access to things. Temple archives, lists of kings, chronicles that went back thousands of years. He organized the pharaohs into 30 dynasties. We still use that system. But we don't have his history. We have pieces of it, quotations in later writers like Josephus. We have the skeleton, but the flesh and blood of it, the stories he told, the details of ceremony and conflict, that's gone. Next to his scroll was the work of Berossus, another priest, this one from Babylon. He wrote a history of Mesopotamia. He translated cuneiform records into Greek. He wrote about the Great Flood, about kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years, about the wisdom of the god Ons. His voice was a bridge, a direct bridge from the clay tablets to the Greek-speaking world. That bridge collapsed, only fragments are left, and these weren't isolated cases. Think of the whole genre, local history. Every city-state, every region had its chroniclers. They wrote about founding myths, treaties, droughts, the deeds of local heroes. The Library of Alexandria, in its obsessive collecting, wanted them all. This was the ancient Mediterranean's memory, its collective memory, all in one place. So what does that loss mean? It means we have a blackout. For long stretches of Egyptian history, we have monuments but no narrative. We have a list of pharaohs' names but often no idea what they did, or why one succeeded another. We rely on carvings on temple walls, and that's official propaganda. It's not history. For Babylon, we have economic tablets, lists of barley shipments, but we lost the national story, the sweeping story that wove those details into something whole. That gap creates mysteries, mysteries we can never solve. Take the Sea Peoples, a coalition of raiders. They shattered empires around 1200 before the Common Era. Egyptian inscriptions mention them, triumphant reliefs, but what were their origins? What did they call themselves? What was their side of the story? A comprehensive history from the Hittite Empire or from the cities they destroyed might have told us. Those histories were almost certainly in Alexandria. Now the Sea Peoples are just a name, a shadow, a textbook example of a mystery born from a missing page. This void forces a strange archaeology. Historians have to become detectives, piecing together a civilization's life from broken pottery, from coin hoards, from the occasional surviving letter. It's incredible work, but it's inference. We see the aftermath, the broken walls, and we have to guess at the battle. We find a statue of a king and guess at his power. The continuous thread, the cause and effect written by someone who lived it, is severed. And perhaps most painfully, the loss hands the narrative over to the winners. Our main source for the Carthaginian Wars is Rome. Our main source for Alexander's conquests are Greek and Roman authors. The voices of the Persians, the Carthaginians, the countless other cultures were muted. Their own national histories turned to ash. We see them through the lens of their conquerors. Often as barbarians, as antagonists, their own pride, their own logic, their own accounts of resilience are silent. The library was the one place that might have kept those voices alive. As a counterpoint, without it, history itself became flattened, a story told by the survivors of the chaos, not by the full chorus of the ancient world. This silencing of direct testimony, it makes the next loss feel different. The loss of machines, of blueprints, it feels like a different kind of amnesia. The fire didn't happen on one night. There wasn't a single moment when the library burned down. The story of Alexandria is a story of layers, of damage spread over hundreds of years. The first major incident was in 48 BCE. Julius Caesar was caught in a civil war, trapped in Alexandria. He set fire to ships in the harbor to protect his fleet. The fire spread from the docks into the city. It reached warehouses, maybe buildings in the royal quarter where scrolls were kept. Did it burn the main library building? The old accounts aren't clear. Some say 400,000 scrolls were lost. But was that the main collection or just a storage depot? It was a major loss, but probably not the end. Then time passes. The library becomes less central, but it doesn't disappear. In the 3rd century CE, the Roman Emperor Aurelian fought to retake the city. The palace district, where the library's main building was, became a battlefield. There was heavy damage, maybe destruction, more scrolls gone, more scholars left. Then, in 391, a different kind of fire. The Christian Emperor Theodosius ordered pagan temples closed. In Alexandria, the Patriarch Theophilus destroyed the Serapeum Temple. That temple had probably become a secondary home for books after the earlier damage. A chronicler writes about the temple being torn down. This wasn't an attack on a library, but any scrolls kept there would have been lost. So the timeline changes the story. The knowledge didn't vanish all at once. It leaked away over time. Scrolls burned in a wartime accident. They were crushed when a roof fell in during a siege. They were thrown out as outdated or as heresy when politics and religion changed. They just rotted in storage because no one had the money or the desire to copy them anymore. It was a slow dimming of a light, not a sudden blackout, that makes the history difficult. You can't point to one event and say, this work was lost here. That manual was lost there. The loss was cumulative, anonymous. A scroll on mechanics crumbles. A bundle of poems is used for kindling. A unique history is eaten by worms in a damp cellar. This long decline feels more tragic than one catastrophe. A quick disaster is a clean wound. A slow bleed means a society losing its will to keep its own memory. It means the value of that collection wasn't understood anymore or was even fought against. The fire was a symptom of changing priorities, of conflict, of entropy winning against human understanding. And as that light faded, it took a certain kind of genius with it, the engineers, the tinkerers, the ones who saw the world as a machine to be understood. Alexandria's silence left some very practical genius in the dark. These were master engineers. Their work wasn't just for show. They understood pressure. They understood levers and steam. There was a man named Ctesibius. He built a pipe organ powered by water and air. He built a water clock so precise it could measure time in minutes. His student was Hero of Alexandria. Hero left a book called Pneumatica. In it, he describes a sphere that spins from steam jets. We call it an eolipile. It was a toy, a temple wonder, but the principle was there. Steam could do work. The library almost certainly held more. Hero and his teachers wrote manuals. They described how to build complex devices, automatic doors that seemed to open by divine will, mechanical theaters with moving puppets, coin-operated machines that dispensed holy water. These weren't just parlor tricks, they were demonstrations of deep principles in pneumatics, in mechanics, in programming with ropes and weights. What we have of Hero's work is probably just the popular summary, the showpiece catalogue, the advanced texts, the ones with the mathematics, the material specifications, the failed experiments that taught the most valuable lessons. Those scrolls likely never left Alexandria. Think about what that loss meant. A working steam engine in Hero's time wasn't a matter of missing intelligence. It was a matter of missing context. Without those detailed technical libraries to build on, each generation had to start from near zero. The foundational knowledge of how to contain pressure efficiently, how to convert linear motion to rotary motion at scale, how to forge metals for that purpose, it wasn't passed down. It was rediscovered painfully and slowly over 1,000 years later. The trajectory was broken. You see a single, isolated point on a graph. Hero's steam toy, with no connecting line to the Industrial Revolution. The line itself was erased, so when we marvel at the intricate clockwork of the Middle Ages or the sudden burst of invention in the 18th century, we're seeing humanity climb a ladder whose middle rungs were missing. They had to carve new ones based on fragments and guesswork. The loss of these engineering texts is maybe the most visceral what if of Alexandria. It wasn't just philosophy becoming obscure. It was the direct, tangible delay of machines, of industry, of a different shape for daily life. And while those blueprints turned to ash, something else was being lost, the living, breathing community that produced them. The scrolls were one thing, but a library isn't just an archive. It's a conversation, and for centuries that conversation happened in the halls of the Mausian. Eratosthenes, he didn't just do that one calculation about the earth and stop. He was the head librarian. He wrote on geography, on philosophy, on chronology. He made draft maps, corrected calculations, wrote letters debating other thinkers. All of that, the messy, iterative work, that was the real life of the place. Aristarchus of Samos was the one who first put the sun at the center. We only know that because Archimedes mentions it in a letter that survived. But Aristarchus's own notebooks, the pages where he sketched orbits, worked through the math, answered his own doubts, those were the working files. And they were almost certainly in Alexandria. That's the deeper layer of the loss. We have the published paper, but we've lost the lab. We have the final theorem, but not the crumpled pages of failed proofs that led there. The polished works that came down to us, like Euclid's Elements, they're masterpieces of clean logic. They hide the struggle. They silence the years of debate in the colonnade's arguments over a line of poetry or the function of a nerve. The personal letters between a mathematician in Alexandria and an engineer in Syracuse, a teacher's lecture notes explaining a complex idea to a room of students. Those were the living synapses of the ancient mind, and when the library suffered, those connections were cut. We're left with magnificent statues, but we can't hear the sculptor's hammer. We see the destination, but the map of the journey is ash. That silencing of the human voice, reducing a vibrant community to a handful of names and titles, it makes the next kind of loss feel especially sharp. It wasn't just science that got distilled down to its survivors. The same ruthless filter was applied to the stories ancient people told about themselves. We have 7 plays from Sophocles. He wrote more than 120. That number alone, it starts to show you what's missing. The tragedians we know, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, they're not the whole picture. They're just the ones we kept hearing because people kept copying them. Behind them, there were hundreds of other playwrights. Their names are gone. Their plays are gone. The library at Alexandria had all of them. It had every play in a trilogy, not just the one that got saved for school. It had the satyr plays too, the funny, crude ones that came after a tragedy. That was the full show. Without them, we're not in the audience. We're looking through a keyhole, and it goes beyond plays. There's lyric poetry, the personal stuff, sung to music. We have pieces of Sappho, enough to see she was brilliant, but her 9 books mostly gone. For others, like Alcaeus or Pindar, we only have scraps, and then there are the epics around Homer. Poems like the Cypria about how the Trojan War started, or the Nostoi about the other heroes trying to get home. These weren't minor works, they were central. People painted them on vases, writers referred to them. Now they're lost, so we're looking at a mural where most of the story, the context around the main scenes, has been painted over. This isn't just missing stories, it's missing how the art changed. Over 90% of the plays are gone, so we can't see the experiments, the ideas that didn't work. What was popular? We have the masterpieces that lasted, but not the steps to get there, not the competing styles. A playwright like Agathon Aristotle said he was original. He made up his own plots instead of using myths. Now he's just a name. His plays are gone. What other risks did people take? What other kinds of comedy were there besides Aristophanes? The library had that map. Losing it means we see a few mountains and think that's the whole range, and that creates an echo. The works that survived were mostly the ones picked for Roman schools. They became the classics, so they got copied. That shapes everything. Our whole idea of Greek thought, their values, their humor, it all comes through this narrow filter. It makes their world seem more unified than it was. The lost 90% had the arguments, the regional differences, the odd voices. Without them, we forget how loud and messy that conversation really was. It turns a complicated debate into a speech given by a few approved people. And if losing those voices seems distant, then there's the Catalogue, the master list that organized it all. That's gone too, the tool that made sense of the collection. Callimachus was a poet, and he knew the library. He walked the halls, but he also tried to make sense of it. He created the Pinakes. It was a monumental task, hundreds of thousands of scrolls, no titles on the spines, no standard system. He didn't just list names. He built a framework. Each author got a brief biography. Each work got a note on its authenticity, its subject, even its opening line to identify it. And then he sorted them all into genres: epic, tragedy, history, law, philosophy, medicine. This was the first known attempt in the Western world to map all of human knowledge. Systematically, losing that map is a different kind of loss. It's not losing a book, it's losing the index to every book. Think of a modern library. You take away every computer terminal, every call number. And then you scatter the books. You still have the books, but you have no way to find anything. You don't know what's there. You don't know how it connects. The Pinakes was more than a finding aid. It showed us how the librarians saw the world of ideas, what they put next to what. Did they link medicine to philosophy or to agriculture? How they defined a genre. Their categories reveal their mental landscape. Without it, we're outsiders, trying to guess the floor plan of a demolished building from a pile of bricks. This loss obscures relationships. We have surviving works by a doctor like Galen, but without the Pinakes, we don't know what other medical texts were on the shelf beside his. We don't know what commentaries existed. We don't know which works were considered definitive and which were seen as fringe. The Catalogue was a living document. Updated as new scrolls arrived, it was the intellectual heartbeat of the institution. Its absence means we see the ancient world's knowledge as a series of isolated islands. Plato over here, Hippocrates over there, when the library itself saw them as part of a single, interconnected continent. So when we try to rebuild that architecture today, we're working backwards. Scholars piece together references from other books. They look at what a later writer quoted. It's detective work, but it's guesswork. We're trying to reconstruct a conversation where we've only heard one side. And we've lost the list of everyone who was in the room. That missing context is profound, especially when you consider a field built on precise, accumulated observation. The medical knowledge that was housed just a few shelves away. The missing map of knowledge meant entire fields had to be rediscovered from scratch. Medicine is the clearest example. We know the name Hippocrates. A collection of writings survived, but that surviving work is just a fraction. The library at Alexandria was the central place for medical knowledge. From across the known world, it held the famous texts, but also the debates, the case studies, the failed experiments, the detailed records that showed medicine as a living science. And it held the work from the medical school right there in Alexandria, a place where, for a brief time, scholars could do something revolutionary. They performed human dissection. Two names stand out: Herophilus and Erasistratus. In the early 3rd century B.C.E., they did systematic studies inside the library. They weren't just theorists. They were pioneers of observation. Herophilus distinguished nerves from blood vessels. He studied the brain. He named parts of it. He proposed it as the seat of intelligence. He analyzed the pulse. He used a water clock to time its rhythm, turning it from a vague feeling into a quantifiable tool. Erasistratus traced the branching pathways of the nervous system. He investigated the heart and its valves. Their work was documented in illustrated atlases, detailed, labeled drawings of the human body based on direct observation. From the 3rd century B.C.E., these weren't symbolic, they were scientific documents, and they are gone. The loss of those atlases and the commentary that went with them is one of the most costly setbacks. Because without those visual guides, the direct lineage of anatomical knowledge broke. Later physicians, even brilliant ones like Galen centuries later, often had to rely on animal dissections. On inherited theories, some of which were wrong. For over 1,000 years, medicine in Europe leaned on textual authority, not on renewed hands-on exploration. The idea that you could understand the body by opening it up faded, and this wasn't just academic, it had a human cost. Surgeries were more perilous. Understanding of disease was clouded by incorrect models of how organs worked. Progress in treating illness was slowed immeasurably. What makes the loss so sharp is its specificity. We didn't just lose the general idea that dissection was useful, we lost the precise data, Herophilus's measurements, Erasistratus's diagrams of nerve pathways. Their notes on the differences between one body and another. This was high-resolution knowledge, and it dissolved into low-resolution rumor. Later scholars knew these men had done great work. But they were left with second-hand summaries, stripped of the visual proof, stripped of the raw observations. The foundation for empirical medicine had been laid. And then the blueprint was burned. So when the Renaissance revived human dissection, artists and scientists like Leonardo and Vesalius weren't building on ancient precision. They were starting over, rediscovering what had been known and meticulously drawn centuries before. This pattern of loss didn't just erase facts, it actively reshaped the narrative of history that managed to survive. That survival bias put a permanent filter over the ancient world. The voices that reached us, they got here not because they were the most brilliant or the most truthful, but because they were the most useful to the societies that came later. The Roman education system loved Virgil and Cicero. They became the core of the curriculum. Medieval monks copied Plato and Aristotle because those works seemed compatible with Christian theology or foundational to it. Arabic scholars preserved Ptolemy's astronomy and Galen's medicine because they had immense practical value, and that created a feedback loop. The more a text was copied, the more copies existed to be copied again. That cemented its place in the canon, but a revolutionary text on steam mechanics or a philosophical rival to Plato, sitting on a single shelf in Alexandria, it had no such network. Its fate depended on that one repository. And when that was gone, it was just erased. So the ancient world we know is really the ancient world that late Roman bureaucrats and medieval monks and Islamic caliphs decided was worth keeping. It's a version of history curated by a long chain of selective librarians, which means we might be missing the radical ideas, the unpopular opinions, the complex technical manuals that didn't fit into a standard school lesson. Our window into antiquity has a very specific frame. It favors certain genres and certain thinkers. It gives us a coherent narrative, but it could be misleading. We see a straight line from Plato to the modern world, but that line is an artifact of preservation. The true intellectual landscape was a dense forest of competing ideas, and we're left studying a few well-trodden paths through that forest. The rest of the wilderness, with all its strange and wonderful flora, stays hidden in the silence. That ghostly imprint of the loss, it pushes us into a more speculative realm, to wonder about the spiritual soundscape that was also silenced. The ancient world's spiritual life wasn't one religion. It was thousands of them, a whole tapestry of local threads. Each one had its own stories, its own songs, its own sacred instructions, and the Library of Alexandria tried to collect all of that. So you'd have Homer, but you'd also have a scroll from a priestess on Samothrace, a scroll with the exact steps for initiation, the chants for the mysteries of the great gods, or a manual from an Asclepius sanctuary, listing the ritual preparations for dream healing, which herbs to burn, which hymns to sing to invite the god. These were the original sources, the living scripts written by the faithful themselves, and their loss is profound, because it means we're almost always listening secondhand. We learn about the cult of Isis from a Greek novelist or a Roman historian who might be fascinated or skeptical or just getting the details wrong. We piece together the Eleusinian mysteries from philosophical texts, from scattered archaeology, but the actual words spoken in the initiation chamber. The tone of voice, the sequence of actions that held such power, those are gone. We've lost the practitioner's voice, so we understand the idea of the rituals. But we can't access the experience. It's like reading a summary of a piece of music. Instead of hearing the music itself, the emotional resonance is gone. The community bonding, the personal revelation in those precise phrases, all evaporated, and this silencing touches even the major gods. We know the broad strokes of the Demeter and Persephone myth. But how did the story change from one Attic village to another? What local variations existed for a specific farming community or a particular family's tradition? Those regional narratives are mostly gone, and they're what gave universal myths their local meaning. So the loss of these manuals and hymns, it means the ancient world has lost its spiritual soundtrack. We can see the grand temples, we can read the philosophers on the divine, but we can't hear the murmur of prayer in 100 languages. We can't feel the collective anticipation before a sacred rite. And it renders a core dimension of ancient life strangely silent, a dimension that governed harvests and healing, politics and personal identity. Now it's just distant. It wasn't all darkness, though. There's a fact that changes things. Not every scroll in Alexandria was the only one. The ideas of the ancient world moved through other places too. There were other centers of learning. The library at Pergamum, for example, had similar ambitions. Roman aristocrats had their own private libraries full of Greek works. And then later, the work of preservation moved. It went to the Byzantine Empire, where monasteries became places to copy and keep texts. And then in the 9th century, there was a huge project in Baghdad at the House of Wisdom. Scholars there started a massive translation effort. They took Greek works on philosophy, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and translated them into Arabic. This wasn't just copying, it was scholarship. They added commentaries, they expanded the ideas. Because of that, we have Aristotle's Organon, we have Ptolemy's Almagest. We have the medical works of Galen. These survived the physical decay of papyrus because they were translated and recopied and studied across continents and over centuries. That reality lets us see the loss more clearly. It sharpens the focus. The real tragedy wasn't for the popular texts, the ones that were widely distributed. It was for the unique things, the singular editions, maybe with notes in the author's own hand. The personal lecture notes of a great thinker, things never meant to be published. The specialized monographs from a single school of thought that had no audience anywhere else. And maybe the most devastating loss, the complete works of cultures that were themselves being erased. When their own libraries and temples were gone, Alexandria was the last repository, and when it fell, their voice went silent completely. That distinction leads to one of the most poignant silences. A vanished world we know almost only through what its conquerors wrote down. The silence around Carthage is one of the most deliberate silences we have. Rome broke the city in the final war. The destruction was absolute. They razed it. They sowed the fields with salt. They tried to erase the culture from memory. But before that, Carthage wasn't a barbaric outpost. It was a maritime empire, a trade network, a place of knowledge that stretched across the Mediterranean, down the Atlantic coast of Africa. And the scholars in Alexandria, collecting every book in the world, they almost certainly sent agents to its ports. They would have looked for scrolls. For records, they would have brought them back for the library. So when the physical city was destroyed, its intellectual legacy might have survived in Egypt. Until that was lost too, what would those scrolls have held? Their own history. The Carthaginians were Phoenician, and they kept meticulous records. Annals of their voyages, their colonies, their treaties, their own view of the conflicts with Rome and Greece. Instead, we have the history of Carthage written by its enemies. By Roman historians like Polybius, who saw the destruction, by later writers like Livy, We hear about child sacrifice, cunning treachery, stories that justified Rome's victory. The Carthaginian side of it, their justifications, their triumphs, their daily life, that's gone. Then there's the practical knowledge. Carthage was an agricultural power. Their agronomist Mago wrote a manual, 28 volumes on farming. It was so respected that after the city fell, the Roman Senate ordered it translated into Latin. That Latin translation is now lost. We only know about it from references in later Roman farming texts, but the original Punic version, with its specific techniques for olives and grapes in North Africa, for soil and irrigation, that was probably in Alexandria. Losing it was a concrete setback for agricultural science in the region and geography. Carthaginian sailors sailed far down the West African coast. Maybe to the Gulf of Guinea. One named Hanno left a sailor's log, a periplus. It survives in a later Greek summary, but the full, original account, the first-hand descriptions of the coastline, the wildlife, the communities, that would have been a treasure. Losing it clips our map. It leaves a blank space where there should have been observation. Finally, their own texts, their religion, their poetry, their civic traditions. All of it is filtered through foreign, hostile interpretations. We have no Carthaginian plays, no hymns, no philosophy. Their cultural voice was silenced twice. First by Roman swords, then, perhaps finally, by the slow decay of papyrus in a library that burned. This loss isn't just missing information, it's a distortion. When you only hear one side of a story, you're left with a ghost of a civilization, seen only in the shadow it cast on its enemies. And that pattern, that single devastating silence, it applies to individuals too. Where losing one person's life work can alter an entire field. Euclid's work is a masterpiece. It's this clean, logical structure. It's shaped minds for 2,000 years. But a finished theorem is like a mountain peak. It doesn't show you the hidden paths, the false starts, the cliffs people faced before they found a route up. The Library of Alexandria held the maps for those failed expeditions. It was the workshop of ancient mathematics, not just the showroom. Take Diophantus. A few books of his Arithmetica survive. They're a collection of problems. Find a number with certain properties, but his full work was much larger, almost certainly in the library. In those lost volumes, he was playing with what we'd call algebra, using symbols for unknown quantities, moving beyond geometry into this abstract world of number theory. Centuries later, when a copy reached Europe, it inspired Pierre de Fermat. In his margin, Fermat wrote his famous last theorem. He claimed to have a proof, but the margin was too small. It took over 350 years for someone else to prove it, and you wonder, did Diophantus in a lost scroll already approach the problem? Did he leave a hint that could have shortened that journey? We'll never know. Then there's Apollonius of Perga. We know he wrote a groundbreaking work on conic sections, the math of ellipses, parabolas, hyperbolas. One crucial copy survived outside Alexandria, but he wrote other books, many of them, on all sorts of advanced geometry, all gone, and with them we lose how he thought. The intuitive leaps, the diagrams sketched in sand, the letters he might have sent to other scholars arguing about a proof, that's the deeper loss. We have the conclusions, but we're missing the conversation. Mathematics isn't a monologue, it's a dialogue across time. A scholar in Alexandria would read a proof by Euclid, then write in the margin, "This step is unclear." Here's a more elegant method. Those marginal notes, those personal letters, were a living record. They showed the struggle, the dead ends, the frustration and brilliance. Without them, ancient mathematics seems like a series of miracles, fully formed. It hides the human process of trial and error and collaboration. Losing these working papers created a gap. When mathematics revived in the Renaissance, scholars started from the finished products. They had to reverse engineer the thought, rediscover paths the Alexandrians had already walked and abandoned. It's like being given a perfect, intricate clock, but all the design drafts, the failed gears and sketches were burned. You could admire the clock, you could copy it. But understanding how to invent such a thing yourself, that knowledge went up in smoke, and that pattern, losing not just the product but the process, that extends to every specialized field the library nurtured. There was this explorer, Pytheas, Greek. He came back from the north with a story that was hard to believe. He said he'd sailed to a place, Thule, where in the summer the sun hardly goes down, and the ocean itself turns into a kind of thick, slushy ice. He wrote it all down in a book on the ocean. It was a big deal at the time, a first-hand record of Britain's coastline, the people there, their amber trade. Things we'd now call the midnight sun and sea ice. That original book is gone, probably was in the library. We only know about Pytheas because later geographers, Strabo for one, quoted him just to say he was making it up. So the direct account is lost, and what's left is the commentary from people who didn't believe him. That was the point of the geography section, really. It wasn't for collecting myths, it was about funding expeditions, getting those field reports back. They were like mission reports, like from NASA, but also like an anthropologist's notes. Agents would come back from the Indian Ocean with sailing routes. They'd note the monsoon winds where the safe ports were. Expeditions down the coast of Africa would record the shape of the land, the tides that no one in the Mediterranean had ever seen. And they'd write about the people they encountered. These weren't just tales, they were data. Astronomical observations to plot positions on a map, lists of what resources were available. Notes on languages, on customs. Losing those raw reports, it set understanding back, directly. Medieval map makers, they didn't have these empirical charts to work from. So they went back to tradition, to theology. The world got smaller in their minds and distorted. Places Pytheas described accurately became legends, mythical islands on a map. That confident knowledge of Africa's coastline turned into guesswork. The careful records of Atlantic tides, which could have taught them so much about the moon's pull, were just gone. Geography didn't just stall, it moved backwards. For centuries, the best maps they could make were worse than what an Alexandrian scholar could have just taken off the shelf. And that's a silence, a profound one. We lost the voices of the people Pytheas met. His notes on the Britons would have been invaluable, how they organized themselves, what they believed, what their music was like. The library would have had reports like that from the Silk Road, describing the tribes of Central Asia, or from the Red Sea, detailing the kingdoms in ancient Yemen. This wasn't just clipping geography's wings. It was closing a window on the sheer variety of the ancient world, leaving us to reconstruct whole cultures from broken pottery and from the accounts of their enemies who usually had a bias. That silencing of specific, observed detail, it applies to something else too. Another kind of loss, the complete works of an entire civilization, erased not by a single fire but by the deliberate policy of a rival empire. Strato of Lampsacus. He should be as famous as Aristotle. He ran the Lyceum, Aristotle's own school, and he took it somewhere new. Aristotle worked from first principles. But Strato, he got his hands dirty. He was an experimentalist. He tested things. He studied falling objects, how they picked up speed. He explored the vacuum, what empty space might be. He wrote volumes on it, on physics, on motion, on the nature of things, and almost all of it is gone. We only know him because a few later writers mentioned him in passing. The Library of Alexandria would have held it all, his complete writings, his notes, his arguments, his failed experiments. That whole library from one mind vanished. It's a single author catastrophe, and Strato isn't the only one. He's just the clearest example. Think of Sappho. They called her the 10th muse, but we have fragments, just tattered pieces. The library held the complete works, or Diophantus, the mathematician. His algebra inspired thinkers for centuries. We have part of his major work, but how much more was there? How many other mathematicians, names we don't even know, solved problems that wouldn't be tackled again until the Renaissance? Their work was on those shelves. Each one is a complete intellectual world, extinguished. It's not just losing a book, it's losing an entire mind, its unique pathways, its particular way of seeing. And that creates a distortion. The thinkers who survive aren't necessarily the best or most innovative. They're the ones who are popular, useful to power, or whose students copied them diligently. Aristotle's works were copied endlessly because he was foundational to medieval education. But the thinker who disagreed with him, who had better evidence, if their work was only in Alexandria, it could be silenced forever. This winnowing, this narrowing of the stream, the intellectual history that reaches us is filtered. It's shaped by survival, not merit. We're left listening to a conversation where most voices are muted. Only a few dominant speakers define the whole era. That collective absence has an effect. It makes the past seem simpler, more monolithic than it ever was. We talk about Greek philosophy being dominated by Plato and Aristotle, but in their time they were two voices in a roaring crowd. The Cynics, the Skeptics, the Cyrenaics. Eclectic thinkers blending ideas from everywhere. The library held their manifestos, their debates, their letters. Losing that cacophony makes it seem like everyone was either a Platonist or an Aristotelian. It hides the vibrant, messy, fiercely contested nature of ancient thought. It removes the alternatives, the road not taken. Ideas that could have sparked a different future if they'd stayed in circulation. That silencing shapes not just what we know about the past, it shapes what we believe is possible in the realm of ideas itself. The library had specialists too, working in quiet rooms. They studied things like sound, how it traveled. They mapped sound waves mathematically. They looked at theaters, the one at Epidorus, and understood how the shape, the material, could carry a whisper all the way to the back. This was applied science, public address, and it was lost right when Rome was building its amphitheaters, its courts. Then there was optics. Euclid wrote on perspective, but the library held what came after. A researcher named Ptolemaic the astronomer, another one he did experiments, measured how light bent going from air into water, into glass. They wrote on reflection. Had early theories of vision, debated whether sight was a beam from the eye or light coming into it. These were step-by-step records. The loss of those texts meant lens grinding stayed trial and error. Could have had telescopes centuries earlier. Imagine Galileo with a 1,000-year head start, and then magnetism, the lodestone. A few fragments mention it. Thales thought it had a soul, but in Alexandria they wouldn't have stopped at poetry. They tested things, they catalogued, they would have documented its properties. Did they map its pull, float a lodestone on cork, see it point north-south? We have hints. The manuals are gone. That missing knowledge delayed navigation. The precise magnetic compass, it powered the age of exploration that might have come from the Mediterranean. Instead, it came later from China through trade routes. The fire didn't just erase abstract ideas, it erased potential tools, delayed how we understood the physical world. The most practical key that burned was a linguistic one. Alexandria was a Tower of Babel in the best sense. Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, Persian voices all mingling in the halls. To make sense of that world, the scholars didn't just collect stories. They dissected language itself. They were creating the ancient world's phrase books, its dictionaries, systematic grammars for languages that were foreign to them. You picture a scholar, ink-stained fingers, comparing a line of Homer with a Phoenician trade ledger, trying to map one set of symbols onto another. They produced bilingual editions, side-by-side scrolls for translation. And they likely wrote the definitive guides to Egyptian, not just the formal hieroglyphs on temple walls, but the everyday demotic script, the script from the markets, from legal documents. The loss of those tools is a quiet catastrophe. It means when the last person who could read Demotic passed away, that knowledge wasn't sleeping in a library waiting. It was gone, so centuries later, when a French soldier dug up the Rosetta Stone with its triple inscription, the scholars of Europe faced a puzzle. They had the Greek. They had the hieroglyphs, and they had this strange, cursive Demotic script in the middle. They knew it was the same text in 3 languages, a perfect key. But without that foundational work from Alexandria, without those dictionaries and guides, it still took decades of brilliant, painstaking guesswork to crack the code. A single reference text from the library's shelves could have turned that decades-long struggle into a matter of months. The history of Egyptology, our understanding of pharaohs and pyramids, could have begun not in the 19th century, but perhaps in the Renaissance. We lost more than words, we lost the manuals, the very manuals needed to hear the voices of entire civilizations. The night sky was quiet, but it held data. Valuable data. Hipparchus in the 2nd century BCE, he wasn't just looking up, he was taking a census, a cosmic one. His original star catalogue, it was meticulous. He recorded positions, brightness, maybe 850 stars. We only know about it because Ptolemy mentioned it later, in the Almagest, but Ptolemy was writing a textbook. He was synthesizing the raw data, though Hipparchus's own notebooks with the nightly notes, the corrections, those were probably in Alexandria. It's the difference between reading a summary of a discovery and having the lab journals. The summary gives you the conclusion, the journals show you the process, the dead ends, the insight, the exact measurements that might have gotten rounded off later. Losing that original catalogue meant losing the benchmark, the fixed point, so later astronomers, even 1,000 years later, they had no ancient starting point to compare against. They couldn't easily see how the stars had shifted, that slow drift precession. They were trying to measure a drift without a clear starting point on the map. And beyond the catalogue, there were other scrolls, generations of observations from the library's own scholars, night after night, notes on comets, on the paths of planets, on stars that flickered. This was a long-term experiment, a continuous record spanning lifetimes. Destroying it reset the clock. So when science reawakened in the Renaissance, Copernicus, Galileo, they had to build their understanding on a much shorter timeline of data. They were rediscovering truths, but without that deep, ancient baseline. The delay in figuring out the solar system wasn't just about ideas being suppressed. It was also about data being erased, 1,000 years of watching gone to ashes, leaving later minds to start the watch all over again. So much of what was lost weren't just ideas. They were instructions. The deepest loss might be the futures we never saw. Take Hero of Alexandria. He built a steam-powered device, a spinning sphere called an eolipile. It was a temple wonder, a curiosity, but his surviving writings, they suggest that was just a start. The library probably held his deeper engineering manuals, the ones that moved from demonstration to real application. If those texts had been studied not as magic but as mechanics, if they'd been copied, debated, improved over centuries. The foundational principle for steam power was there, in that library, over 1,000 years before the first coal-fired engines of the 18th century. Losing it meant that principle had to be rediscovered much later. It cut off a possible lineage, not that the Romans would have built locomotives, but a continuous thread of experimentation, passed down, could have changed the pace of progress entirely. The same with medicine. Herophilus and Erasistratus in Alexandria, they did something radical. They conducted detailed studies of the human body. They identified nerves, differentiated between sensory and motor functions, studied the brain. Their work was empirical, direct observation. Their illustrated atlases would have been the definitive textbooks of anatomy for 1,000 years, but they were lost. So later medical practice across Europe often relied on Galen's theories. a brilliant physician, but one who mainly dissected animals and extrapolated. For over 1,000 years, doctors were working from a flawed map of the human form. How many procedures weren't attempted? How many illnesses were misunderstood because that precise knowledge had turned to ash? That's the true cost. It's not just missing facts in a history book. It's the alternate timelines of human capability that were closed off. Every time a society has to reinvent a concept from first principles, it loses the momentum of cumulative knowledge. The burning of the library didn't just set us back, it forced civilization down a longer, more winding road. The conversation back then was a lot louder than we think. We remember the big voices now, the ones that lasted: Plato and his ideals, Aristotle and his logic, the Stoics with their virtue, the Epicureans with their quiet pursuit of peace. But those were just the winners, really, the threads that got pulled through. The Library of Alexandria had the whole cloth. It kept everything. The movements that are just footnotes to us now, they had their full say there. The Cynics who threw out every rule and lived with nothing. The Cyrenaics who said the only point was to feel good, right in the moment. The skeptics who doubted you could ever really know anything for sure. Their actual books, their full arguments, the debates they had among themselves, most of that is gone. We mainly know them from what their enemies said about them. Which is like trying to understand a whole side in a fight, but you only ever hear from the other side. What's lost is the texture, the choice. It makes ancient thought seem like there were only 4 options on the table. But it wasn't a limited menu, it was a marketplace, a crowded one, and even within those big schools there was variety. There were these public debates in the city squares. The library probably had records of those. Philosophy wasn't just something you read, it was something you went and watched. It was a kind of public sport. A civic event. Losing those records, it silences the crowd. You lose the heckling, the applause, the turn of a phrase that won the day. You lose the feeling of it as something alive. Something human, and that flattening has a cost. It makes the past seem decided. It makes it seem like the ideas that survived were the best ones, the right ones. But maybe they were just the ones that got copied the most, the ones that were useful later on to the people in charge, the ones that fit what came next. By losing the full range, we lost other tools, other ways to think about how to live, what's good, what's real. A different version of skepticism, if we had all of it, might have sent science down another path. A full set of Cynic writings might have given later centuries a sharper way to question everything around them. Instead, we got a streamlined version. An almost official history of ancient wisdom. And we're missing the rebellious parts, the strange ideas, the brilliant, half-finished thoughts that could have started whole new revolutions much later on. A void doesn't stay empty. Nature and human nature, they can't stand it. So when the original sources from Alexandria were gone, something else rushed in. Stories, guesses, half-remembered facts that got twisted. The library's own history shows this. We have these wild, competing legends that it held 500,000 scrolls, or maybe 700,000. That every ship in the harbor was searched, that scrolls were taken and copied. Some stories say there was a second, smaller library in a temple, which burned later. We don't know the exact number. We don't have the original inventory, so the mystery grew. It became a symbol of perfect knowledge lost, and the symbol became bigger and more perfect than the real thing likely ever was. This is what happens. You lose the anchor of a primary text, and the ship of understanding starts to drift. It can drift for centuries. Think about a scientist from that era like Pythagoras. We know the name, the theorem, but the man himself, he wrote nothing down, at least nothing that survived to reach Alexandria. His school was secretive. So after the loss of any first-hand accounts from his followers that might have been in the library, what filled the gap? Mysticism, legends, stories about him forbidding beans, about his golden thigh, about divine powers. His mathematical genius got tangled up with these mystical beliefs because the clear, rational texts that might have separated the man from the myth were gone. The same thing happened to history. An Egyptian pharaoh's reign, detailed in a history by the priest Manetho that was in the library, becomes a vague list of names and strange stories in later, third-hand accounts. A precise astronomical observation becomes a poetic illusion about the gods. This corruption had a very long tail. When the Renaissance began and scholars in Europe started rediscovering ancient Greek texts, often through Arabic translations, they weren't getting a clean signal. They were getting a signal that had passed through 1,000 years of static. A text by Aristotle might be bundled with pages of commentary from medieval philosophers who were themselves working from flawed copies or summaries. The original, clean thought was buried under layers of interpretation, some of it brilliant, but much of it adding assumptions and errors. Scholars had to become detectives, trying to scrape away the medieval paint to find the classical fresco underneath. They were constantly asking, is this what Plato actually said, or is this what a 12th century monk thought he meant? The fire didn't just create a gap. It made the ground around the gap unstable. It made everything that survived harder to trust, harder to see clearly. We are still, in many ways, doing that archaeology. Sifting through the fragments, trying to tell the original song from the echoes. The library wanted everything, all the world's knowledge. That meant poetry, philosophy. But also the paperwork, the empire's records, the thousands of papyrus sheets from daily life in Egypt, a customs form for olive oil from Crete with the price, the merchant's name. A labor contract for a scribe on a canal, wages paid in grain, a farmer's petition about a neighbor flooding his field, census records, marriage contracts, wills. This is the raw data of human existence, what things actually cost, how disputes were settled, how grain was taxed, how families were built. It gives names to the invisible people. The farmers, the sailors, the clerks, their loss is profound. We see the ancient economy in broad strokes. Trade happened, taxes existed, but we miss the fine print. We have to guess the price of bread in Alexandria. We reconstruct law from later Roman codes, not from the messy, everyday court cases that show how law was applied or ignored. It's the difference between a constitution and a small claims court docket. One is theory, the other is reality. Without these documents, the ancient world is a facade. We see the temples, the statues, we read the epic poems, but we can't hear the marketplace conversations. We can't understand the household worry when wheat prices rose. We lose the texture of ordinary life. Then history is just kings and battles, not the story of how millions lived, worked, navigated their world. That's the whole. Not in grand ideas, but in shared human experience. That silent history of the everyday is a cautionary tale. Its warning echoes far beyond the ancient world. It's in our hands now. We're living in a second age of Alexandria. We're creating an unprecedented volume of knowledge, but it's on an equally fragile foundation. Our scrolls are hard drives, our libraries are server farms, our great works are born as digital files, family photos, government records, entire scientific datasets, works of art. But this medium is deceptively fragile. A magnetic hard drive has a lifespan measured in years, not centuries. File formats become unreadable as software evolves. Think of the floppy disk, the zip drive, early websites built with technology no modern browser can display. They're not burning, but they're fading. Becoming ghosts in the machine. Archivists call this the digital dark age. It's that potential future moment when historians look back at our era and find vast gaps. Not because we produced nothing, but because we failed to preserve the means to read it. The Library of Alexandria teaches us that preservation isn't passive. It's a constant, active fight against entropy. The ancients had to physically copy a scroll before it crumbled. We have to constantly migrate data, update formats, maintain the infrastructure to access it. Their loss was centralized, a single point of catastrophic failure. Our risk is both centralized in giant corporate cloud servers and wildly decentralized. Across billions of personal devices, any of which can fail, be lost, or simply forgotten in a drawer. So what's truly vulnerable? The raw data from early space missions stored on obsolete tapes. The first digital artworks dependent on specific programs to animate. The personal correspondence of our era, locked in proprietary social media platforms that may one day vanish. Even the mundane, the detailed digital ledgers of small businesses, the geographic data of ecosystems before climate change altered them. These are the potential lost scrolls of the 21st century. The fire in Alexandria was a physical flame. Our danger is a silent, creeping obsolescence, but the lesson is the same. Knowledge requires guardians. It needs deliberate, diversified, and ongoing care. The story of the library isn't just about a past tragedy. It's a mirror, showing us the responsibility we hold right now. To ensure that the sum of our understanding doesn't once again turn to whispers and then to silence. That fire left a silence behind it, but it's not an empty silence. It's full of echoes, echoes of what could have been, a different path for medicine, for technology, for how we understand the stars. We've been tracing the shape of that absence. From the complete works of philosophers down to the day-to-day ledgers of merchants, this was more than a historical tragedy. It was a break, a fracture in the timeline of human discovery. The knowledge that made it through did so because of luck, because it was popular, because it got copied over and over, and that means our whole view of the ancient world is curated by chance. We hear the voices that were shouted the loudest, the ones that echoed down the centuries, but the whispers faded, the complex ideas, the dissenting opinions. They faded away, and that shaping of history, that might be the library's deepest legacy. It forced a narrowing. It funneled all that brilliant, chaotic diversity of ancient thought into a stream. A more manageable stream, but a far less complete one. So what do we do with that now? Today, we're surrounded by more information than the librarians of Alexandria could have imagined. But our own archives face different threats, threats that are just as real: digital decay, online platforms collapsing, forgetting how to read old file formats. The story of the library is a call to action. It asks us to not just consume knowledge, but to guard it, to think about what we save and how we save it. To support the libraries, the physical ones, the digital ones, that keep our collective memory alive. To value the obscure manuscript as much as the bestseller. Because we never know which one holds the key to a future question. The ghost of Alexandria reminds us, civilization isn't measured by what it creates in a moment. It's measured by what it preserves across the ages.